Okay guys, this is the first video lecture for Humanities 1. It feels super awkward, but I'm sure I'll get better at it as time goes by. Um, I'm going to use the questions that you submit, your discussion questions for these lectures, because I want to add something to the class that's not necessarily in the textbook. Otherwise, what are you paying me for? And so I won't use all the questions, but I'll use some of them. And we'll start off with mostly sociology questions about prehistoric people and ancient civilizations. And the first question is, what do we know about prehistoric languages before writing? And the answer is almost nothing. And I want to point that out as something to know when you look at any discussion of prehistoric people, because prehistoric means before history. And so there's a lot of speculation, and I find that a lot of scholars um, say more than they know. They look at prehistoric times and try to make conclusions about what was going on then, and their conclusions are not well founded because we just don't know. And so you'll find that a lot in these kinds of studies. And the more we do know, though, the more we uncover, the more we uh, explode previous ideas about prehistoric people. We're finding new things all the time. And what we're finding is that these people were much more sophisticated, much more like ourselves than people generally thought. And so that's where you get this difference between the idea of the brutish, unintelligent, animal-like caveman and what we now know to be true about them. I mean, the oldest human artifacts that we have are artwork, music, a flute that you can still play. Um, and you don't get that from people dragging their knuckles on the ground. And so there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that cavemen or prehistoric people were very much like ourselves. And a great deal of the um, misinterpretation of these people comes largely from the prejudice of the first Victorian folks who did these scientific studies. And the influence of Darwin at that time was very large, and people were trying to make all scientific inquiry fit into the Darwinian model. And so it was very tempting to look at prehistoric people as primitive, and then we have evolved now to the place where we're more intelligent than they were. And like I said, the more we find of their artifacts, the more we find of these people, um, the less that appears to be true. And um, if we want to look at peoples who live in this kind of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, there's people still doing that today. Some of the Aboriginal folks in Australia are still living that lifestyle. And up until the late 1800s, people on the North American continent were living that way. When we know these folks, Apache Indians, for instance, and they were not crude, unintelligent people. They simply had been living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle for, as far as we know, all the way back into prehistory. And then when Western civilization bumps into these folks, they really don't know what to make of them. So that's one of the difficulties arising from the study of prehistory, and it shows up again and again. And what I want to do is caution us, as scholars, we should only say definitively what we do know. And like I said, not much. And in this question of what we know about prehistoric languages, it's not much. But we can make some guesses. Um, One of the curious features of mythology, and there's mythology which we get from all sorts of ancient civilizations. It's the first sorts of writings that we have are the records of commerce and myth. We see people writing down what they bought and sold, how they took care of business, and we see them writing down their mythologies. But there's a oral tradition of storytelling that's much older, and that's fairy tales. Believe it or not, fairy tales are the oldest literature in the world. And there's this interesting thing that happens where you see nearly identical fairy tales being told by cultures who are vastly different from one another and separated geologically or geographically by a long ways. And so, for instance, there's a fairy tale called The Princess Across the Ocean. and there is a Irish version of it and a Japanese version of it that are nearly identical word for word. And so people have looked at this, linguists and scholars, and thought, well, how would that happen? And there's some speculation, and once again, it's only speculation, that at one time humanity shared a language, and that these fairy tales were originally told in a single group of people sharing a single language. And then as people spread out across the globe, um, these fairy tales were preserved, even though the cultures changed dramatically over thousands of years. And so, but once again, that's just a guess that perhaps there was a unified language at one time and now there isn't one. Um, so our next question is, um, let's see, get my notes here. Why would art carvings have been created, and what was the need for it? And so the question here is why did they do this? Why did ancient people, prehistoric people, draw stuff um, on the walls of these caves? And once again, the answer is we have no idea. We can speculate it had something to do with religion, possibly. We can speculate it had something to do with what's called animistic magic, sympathetic magic. The idea that if we draw this animal and we symbolically hunt it, that will give us the ability to hunt it outside the cave. But we just don't know. Um, we can think, though, about why we do art. Why do we? If these people were not that much different from us, some of the reasons that we do art is for creative expression, right? It's fun to do. There are people who like to draw and are good at it. And it's obvious that the people that did these cave paintings were exceptional artists. They were not, these are not stick figures, right? These are not crude representations of these animals. They are very exact and very lifelike. And they show an artistic touch that is extraordinary even all these thousands of years later. And so, like I said, we just don't know, but we can guess. And that's the way we do with almost everything that's prehistoric. Next question is, was art the first way humans expressed themselves? Where did the concept of art come from? And the answer to that is yes. The first thing we have of people, the oldest artifacts we have, are musical instruments and drawings. That's what we've got. You know, we find stone tools and stone weapons and things like that, but the oldest artifacts we have are a flute and these cave paintings. And so art is definitely something people do. In the Cave of Forgotten Dreams, one of the scientists talked about people as religious, as the thing that distinguishes human beings from every other being that we know of, every animal, is spirituality, homo spirituality, right? People who are religious. But we can also say that same thing about art. People do art, and no other animal does anything like it. There are animals who use crude tools. I have myself seen a horse pick up a stick and scratch himself with it. He couldn't reach. But people don't draw. The horse did not take that stick and draw a picture of another horse on the ground. So people create art, and the oldest things that we have are art and the instruments for making music. Next question. On page 9 of the textbook, it says that the first calendar was devised in Egypt. How did they know how many months, days, and weeks to use, and how much has it changed over the years? What made them realize the need to revise it some more? Now, this is a really interesting question because it really illustrates how a course like this, the Humanities, can help us understand things. Because the answer to that goes way, way, way back to prehistoric times. And then it carries us all the way through to modern times, more or less, on how we get our months and days and weeks and what our calendar looks like. The calendar is divided into months based on the cycles of the moon. It takes the moon about 30 days to go from full to, you can't see it, to full again. It's the cycles of the moon take about that long. And so it's obvious that if you are in a prehistoric setting with no technology, no clocks, something like that, and really no need to be very exact about time. What the moon looks like in the sky would be as good a way as any of telling basically what time it is. And so it begins there. And the Egyptians, what they did is they simply wrote this down. They began to divide things up into days. And the ancient cultures, starting with the Babylonians and the Egyptians, but the Babylonians first, because they were older, they named the days of their weeks after the gods they worshiped. So each god, each major important god would have their own day. The Romans then did the same thing. And so the primary gods that were enshrined in the Roman days of the week were the sun and the moon. And so you have Sunday, and Monday, Moon Day, and the beginning of the week being the day of the sun god, God of the sun, no, the god of the sun. And so as the Roman Empire spread out and began to conquer other people and kind of through this vast empire over the known world, other people adopted the Roman calendar, but they used their own important gods to name their days of the week. And the Romans were just fine with this because the Romans were a polytheistic culture. They did not mind other cultures having other gods as long as you behaved yourself and paid your taxes to Rome. And so when you get to our days of the week, we add to Sunday and Moon Day names that are derived from Anglo-Saxon gods who are derived from Nordic gods. And so you have then Tyr's Day, which is Thursday, and Tyr is the Nordic god of war. Then you have Woden's Day, which is a Anglo-Saxon version of Odin, who's the king of the gods in Norse theology. Then you have Frigga's Day, and Frigga was a female goddess, and she's the god of love and beauty, kind of the Nordic version of Venus. And that's how we get our days of the week. It's how we have days that are named after Norse gods. And so we just hung on to this because it worked for us. Now, another question related to this is what the difference between AD and BC, and then you have CE and BCE. And our book defines years in terms of BCE and CE. So it works this way. It's kind of confusing. My brain doesn't like to wrap itself around things like this, so I'll do my best. AD means Anno Domino in Latin, and that means the year of our Lord. And so if you look at some old English manuscript and things, it'll say, the year of our Lord 1673. It was a Christian way of dividing up time between before Jesus came to the earth and Christianity was founded, and afterwards, because there's this kind of earthquake, this earth-shattering event that happens in the ancient world with the coming of Christianity. Everything changes. And so that's the way people divided things up. So you've got Anno Domino, year of our Lord, which would be after the coming of Christ, and then you have BC, before Christ. But that's kind of we look at scholarship, it's supposed to be universal and worldwide, and we want to, or scholars have wanted to, not overtly Christianize the way that we look at days and years, and so they call this present time CE, Common Era, meaning that most people in the world use the Christian calendar and reckoning of years to know what year it is. And then BCE is before Common Era. And so that's the distinction between those two things and why they were made. Another question. Why did everyone in the past think they needed slaves? And that is a really good question. And once again, it spans a great deal of time. And it's a very interesting question. The truth is that slavery is unimaginably ancient. As far as we know, slavery goes all the way back into prehistory. The first civilizations that we see coming on the scene in writing history, they all have slaves. Slavery is just a given. There will be slaves. Um, this is how the world got its work done. This is how menial labor took place in the ancient world. As far as we know, going back into prehistoric times. If you think about it, if you look at the history of antiquity, and we look at the wars and things that, there were lots of wars, lots of conflicts, lots of rebellions, um, but there were no strikes. Nobody ever said, I'm not working anymore. That didn't happen because slaves don't have that choice. And that's just how things got done. And the way that changed was, once again, when I said the Christianity, the advent of Christianity is this event in history that stops a whole world, a whole history moving forward and begins a new one. Um, it's true just in a scientific sense. If you look at history, slavery begins to end after Christianity arrives on the scene. And it ends in Western civilization almost spontaneously. There was never an uprising of slaves in Europe, for instance. This process happened where gradually people who were slaves became serfs. They became laborers on the land, and their owner, the lord or the noble or the person that provided the leadership and military for that area, that person's job was to protect these people. And the serf's job was to provide the manual labor necessary to keep things rolling along. And serfs have rights, slaves don't. And that just happened spontaneously. People just, because of the way civilization was rolling along, and because of the way that Christianity equalizes people in terms of equal importance to God, people decided slavery wasn't a good idea anymore. And it just sort of gradually died out. Um, Now, it was more or less revived with the African slave trade all the way up until the 1860s and the end of the Civil War. We had slaves, but it was slavery based on a very different thing. The slavery of the ancient world, um, it didn't matter who you were. You were a slave based on your culture got conquered by somebody else, and that it was generally what you did, the Romans did, and the Greeks did, and everybody else. When they conquered someone, they took those people as slaves. And so you have slaves and descendants of slaves, and these slaves belong to different households and different organizations. But they were people. They were people with no rights. They were property, but they weren't looked at as slaves by their very nature. Um, Anyone could be a slave based on whether or not you got conquered by somebody else. Um, the African slave trade, however, was a revival of slavery based on the idea that certain people are inferior and therefore ought to be slaves. And that's a very different point of view. And so, and once again, that continued all the way up until the Civil War. And so it's slavery, but slavery with a kind of different sort of rationale behind it. Next question. How did a small nomadic people such as the Hebrews influence religion on such a large scale so that their one deity is one of the main beliefs of today's world? Once again, it's an awesome question. How did this happen? You have these Hebrew folks, and they're right there at the dawn of history. Okay, the book of Job, for instance, in the Bible, is one of the oldest works of literature that we have. It's way, way, way back there. Many scholars think it's the oldest book of the Bible. And so how did this nomadic people, and they were nomads, they just traveled around. Abraham was a patriarch of that age. He was a nomadic folks. They would take their flocks and they would herd their flocks across the landscape, and that's how they survived. So how did this happen? How did this idea become the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, three of the major religions in the world? And the answer, once again, is complex and interesting, at least to me. You have a difference, and this is really interesting about the world in the ancient times. We have paganism, and we tend to lump all these people together, pagans, people who worship multiple gods. But there were different kinds and flavors of paganism in the ancient world. But the ancient world was uniformly pagan. Everybody believed in multiple gods except for this one people, the Jews. That was it. They were the only folks who had a monotheistic system of belief. And out of, once again, Christianity is this event. It just makes an imprint on history. Um, Christianity arises out of Judaism, and eventually it takes over the Roman Empire. The strongest empire in the history of the world became Christianized as a result of that. And so Christians believe in one God, coming out of the Judaic tradition, believing in one God. And after Rome falls, Islam comes out of the East, and there's nobody there. The Roman Empire is gone. There's no force there to stop them. So Islam grows out of Judaism as well. And so because Christianity took over Rome, and because Rome fell, you have these monotheistic religions becoming dominant in that way. Now, that said, there were some important differences between monotheism and paganism. Pagan gods, there were lots of them, and they added to them all the time. Um, the Rome had a building called the Pantheon, where they had a shrine for every major god of every people that was in the Roman Empire. And so they didn't care which gods you believed in or how many. You just had to submit to Rome at the same time, which the Christians would not do. The big deal with the Christians were they would not let their God be in the Pantheon. They weren't going to set a statue of Jesus next to the statue of the emperor, who was also a god in the Pantheon. They just refused to do it. And so paganism was like this very beautiful. Many of the myths are wonderful. We still have them today. We still know names of these gods. We know about Hercules. We have ideas about Jason and the Argonauts. This mythology still lives with us to a large degree. But with the coming of Christianity, the creative side of paganism ended. There have been no new myths. Nobody makes any new gods like they were doing before that happened. And so the pagans of the Greek and Roman tradition were about the emotional side of life. People have both an intellectual side and an emotional side. And that's the Greeks and Romans were very much aware of those two facets of a person's existence. And so the philosophers, Socrates and Aristotle and that crew, they appeal to the intellectual side of life. Whereas the mythologies, the paganism, that appealed to the emotional side of life. There was a god for every major emotion that might move you and cause you to feel a certain way. So there was a god of war and a god of love. There was even a god of rumor. There were gods of place. Every Roman and Greek household would have had a household god, a little shrine dedicated to the god that's their special home god. We still see echoes of this today. The garden gnome, right? That little statue in the garden. If you could transport somebody from Roman and Greek times to modern times and look at a garden and say, oh, there's a statue, that's the household god. This is a kind of paganism based on having a way to represent and express the emotional side of life. And a great many pagans in that age didn't really believe in the gods. Many of them did, but there were people who just believed the gods were an excellent way to talk about things that you can't talk about otherwise. And so this was Greek and Roman traditional paganism. Now there was another kind of paganism that is much, much darker. We know very little about it because it was destroyed by Rome and by Roman Catholicism, pretty much. There seems to be a religious instinct in human history to look at the gods as agents who will get things done. This god will do what I want if I sacrifice to this god. And the sacrifices those kinds of gods required were inhuman. Basically, the god would do what you wanted if if you sacrificed your humanity to that god. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, in ancient mythology, you have the Baal. The Baal simply means the Lord, and you see that name show up again and again in ancient literature. The Carthaginians worshipped a god called Molech, who was a representative of Baal. The name Hannibal literally means the grace of Baal. And the Carthaginians were so powerful at that time that they nearly destroyed Rome. That's a history we'll look into a little later when we get to the chapters on Rome. But the Carthaginians, their mode of worship was to burn children alive. That's what they did. The female goddess of Carthage was Tanit, and Tanit also required child sacrifice. These echoes of this darkness are with us today. There's a reason the name Hannibal kind of strikes a little bit of chill in us. There's a reason that in Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal the cannibal. Well, the real Hannibal was probably also a cannibal. The wicked old witch in the woods that wants to throw the children into the fire and eat them, that is the priestess of Tanit, as kind of an echo in our collective memories. And that kind of paganism has completely been wiped out from the face of the earth. It really has. After Rome defeated Carthage, they took Carthage apart one brick at a time. They literally disassembled the city and sowed the fields with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. And so that's a part of ancient paganism that, thank goodness, we no longer have with us. Next question. Are the gods and goddesses only immortal because we as humans pass our beliefs in them down from generation to generation? That's a cool question. Does a god die if no one believes in them anymore? I have no idea. But there are a couple of cool books that you can get their novels. The Gray God Passes by Robert E. Howard, who's the author that wrote Conan the Barbarian. And also a book by Terry Pratchett called Small Gods. If you're interested in that question, those are neat books to read. Next question. When society shifted into more of a patriarchy than a matriarchy, at what point did the God we refer to become he? That's another great question. In paganism, you had gods and goddesses. In monotheism, you just have God, and the God is male, masculine. When that happened is when, once again, the shift changes. When Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and paganism just kind of dies out. And it did die out, by the way. That's the other thing. There were no wars between Christians and paganism. That didn't happen. It's not like the Christians took over Rome violently by force. The pagans simply mostly became Christians. And many old ancient churches, Christian churches in the ancient world, were built in the on the foundations and sometimes in the very temples of the pagan gods. There are churches in Rome that were once pagan temples and became Christian churches, but the Christians did not kick the pagans out. The pagans stopped going there. The buildings were left abandoned, more or less. And so the Christians just kind of, oh, let's use this for our church. And so when that happened, the goddesses then become not something people believe in, and the monotheistic God of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, which rises out of the Jewish tradition, is a masculine God. And so that's when that happens. Now, as far as a matriarchy, there is a lot of speculation about prehistoric times that prehistoric people were matriarchal, that the female was the most important, and that their gods were female gods. But we don't know this. We simply have these little rudely carved female figures that we know cavemen, prehistoric people had, but we don't know what they meant to them. We can speculate about it, but we have no idea. Next question. It seems the stigma surrounding prehistoric people is that they were unintelligent or rudimentary. Why does that stigma exist? Why do we not acknowledge their clear ability to understand advanced concepts? And once again, the reason for this comes out of the first scientists who studied prehistoric people were largely Victorians and rich white dudes, and they were very influenced by Darwinism, which was brand new at that time, and people kind of like to tell themselves that they're the highest form of humanity, that we're what cavemen evolved into. And we just don't see any real evidence of that, that the prehistoric people were unintelligent or were primitive or were crude. One of my favorite authors is G.K. Chesterton, and he was a Victorian himself, or just after the Victorians. He was writing about this. And he said the idea that cavemen clubbed women over the head and dragged them off says more about Victorian sexuality than it does about prehistoric sexuality. And it does, because we have absolutely no idea how people who were prehistoric got married and had kids. And the idea that all of these Victorian scientists, as soon as they looked into prehistory, said, oh, they must have been marrying women by capturing them. Once again, it says more about Victorians than it does about prehistoric people. But that's where we get that image from. And so we kind of have this caricature of prehistoric people called the caveman. And there's just not much basis for that in reality. Last question. While reading the introduction, I came across a passage talking about humans having several different species, but only the Homo sapiens did not become extinct. Is this proven by scientific evidence, or is it just a theory? Now, this is an excellent question because it's one of the few parts of our textbook that I find not well written. There's a lot of confusion in that sentence that this question is referring to. And the reason is that science is pretty much confused about this. We don't know. And there, as with other aspects of our understanding of prehistoric people, it's constantly evolving. But at one time, the idea was that there was a separate species called Neanderthals. They're separate from Cro-Magnons, and that the Cro-Magnon, being more developed and more intelligent and better suited to survive, they survived, and the Neanderthals died out. The more we know, the more we find out that image is incorrect. The first skeletons of Neanderthals that people found and looked at were very old people. And so this idea of the kind of stooped and bent over ape-like looking sort of person comes from the fact that the skeleton they were looking at was a very old person who would be stooped over and kind of scrunched up anyway. And once again, this kind of social Darwinism of that age influenced this idea. The more we find out about Neanderthals, the more we see them as fairly equivalent to everybody else. And there's a lot of speculation that these were just human beings, that they were a different ethnic group, but that they were essentially people. And we absolutely know that they intermarried with other groups. And so if your ancestry is from Asia or Europe, you have between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in you. We know this to be true. There's a little part of you that is Neanderthal. And so my opinion is that these were simply people. They were just prehistoric folks like everybody else, a different ethnicity perhaps, but still human beings that we would recognize today. And that is it for video lecture number 1. I hope you get some good out of this. Please get in touch with me. Once again, I know this is a million times in the syllabus and elsewhere, but if you got to talk to me, talk to me. I don't want things to go south without me being aware of what's happening. So use my cell phone if you need to. Email me. Let's get in touch. I've got all the grading done for this week. There's some people that still haven't got stuff in. I'm a little worried about that. But once again, you can submit stuff late. It's a 10% discount on your grade, but it's way better than a 0. So submit discussion questions for next week, and I will tackle those in another lecture the following week. So that's that.